Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The webinar this evening is titled Ranked Choice Voting, a Better Alternative. We're proud to be sponsored by the SC Humanities Electoral Initiative Series and are grateful to Marion University's Department of Political Science and Geography for hosting and setting up this webinar this evening. I'm Dillon Tatum, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Marion, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues today. Dr. Richard Almeida is the John Monroe Marshall Holliday Professor of Political Science at FMU. His main areas of research are American voting behavior, interest groups, and lobbying. Dr. Lauren Perez is with us as well. She's an Assistant Professor of Political Science at FMU. Her research focuses on legislative politics in Europe, where a few countries do use ranked choice voting or some variants of that. Dr. Almeida and Dr. Perez will be guiding us through the central issues, problems, and promises of ranked choice voting today, and will illustrate the ways that RCV has been deployed in elections, both in the United States and around the world. As a note, this webinar is broadcasted live, and we are happily taking questions from the audience. What we'll do is, if you will please write any questions you might have into the live chat, we will attempt to answer as many as we can near the end of tonight's webinar. Just to start us off here, it's no exaggeration to say that Americans are unhappy and underengaged with national elections. Here's just a few pieces of data. Number one, a 2016 Gallup poll found that younger Americans, especially, are unsatisfied with a two-party system. Only 28% agreeing with the statement, quote, "The two major parties represent the American people well." And secondly, while the 2020 election saw better voter turnout than any national election since 1960, only 62% of the voting age population participated in the election. That's remarkably low compared to other Western countries. For example, the US's 2016 election turnout ranked at 30 out of 35 peer OECD countries. Are there ways to increase voter turnout, engagement, and the legitimacy of democratic processes? One proposed way of rethinking elections is through a process known as ranked choice voting. Now, I'll start here with Dr. Almeida. Can you tell us a little bit about ranked choice voting and how it works? What goes into ranked choice voting?
Good evening, Dillon. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to come here and speak about this today. One of my basic sort of beliefs is that regardless of whether one has studied government extensively, people know a lot about politics because to me, politics are just the ways that groups make their decisions. And ranked choice voting really kind of speaks to one of, I think, the core political dilemmas that on a major or minor level that just about everybody has found themselves in at some point. And so I'd like to begin with what some of my mathematician colleagues might call a motivating example, right? A hypothetical that sort of sets the stage for why we're talking about the things that we are talking about. And so here is, for me, a timeless political dilemma. Where do we go for lunch? Can you all see that? This is my first share, right? And so this is a so this is a contrived scenario, but it is, I think, a very realistic one. We have three individuals who want to do something together, go out to lunch. Unfortunately, we all want to go to different places, or we all want different kinds of food. And even in this trivial example, majority rule, quote unquote, democracy doesn't get us very far. We've got three individuals who want three different things, and majority rule of vote is not going to get us to lunch, right? It's going to leave us hungry. And there are ways to kind of finesse or even hack our way out of this, right? One person could change their decision of what they want to eat. We could take turns, right? We could, one of us could pick one week and one of us the next and the next. We could even, flip a coin or something and choose randomly. But, with more than a couple of people and more than a couple of choices, the idea of majority rule breaks down relatively quickly. And a sort of robust way out of this dilemma is to simply add more information, right? Since we know what our choices are, instead of just making a single pick, we could choose instead to rank our alternatives and figure out what we want most, what we want least. And when we start to do that, and I've kind of deliberately engineered these choices for a reason that we may be able to talk about later in my period. But what we get here is when we've all kind of rank ordered our choices, what becomes pretty clear, pardon me, is that there's one choice that's not perfect, but there is one choice that provides the most satisfaction to the group as a whole. And of course, it happens to be my choice, because that's, generally how these things should work, right? But falafel is sort of the group utility maximizing choice. Falafel makes everybody in the group as well off as we can be collectively. And that's a really important thing. One of the questions or one of the comments that we've got in the hopper for later on in the hour is whether this is a good or a fair way to make decisions. One observer in the state of Maine kind of likened it to a game show. And, looking at it this way, I can kind of see the gist of that criticism, but not to give away the store, but ultimately I think that criticism is fairly misplaced. What we're really doing in any kind of ranked voting scheme is we are gathering more information than what we had before. And when we have more information, we very often come up with a better, in a manner of speaking, choice, a choice that is better for the group as a whole instead of individual members. And when we take this out of the realm of lunch and we move it into the realm of electing candidates for office, we arrive at the world of ranked choice voting. Lauren will probably talk about this a little bit more, but ranked choice voting refers to a whole family of ways of making group decisions, of electoral systems. Certainly, as you see, as the name implies, what they all have in common is that voters rank their preferences in order in some way, shape, or form. Two of the more common terms that I have seen in the world is in elections where there is only one winner, this is often referred to as instant runoff voting, or IRV. In situations where there are multiple seats up for grabs, I've generally seen this referred to as the single transferable vote, or STV. These are, these just really are, these just really are different types of ranked voting systems. There are dozens of them, but this is what lies at the core. And, one of the, I think one of the criticisms of these systems that have some validity is, at first glance, they can seem a little bit cumbersome. This is, I'm not sure how easy this is to see. That the graphic was not great when I downloaded it. But what you have here is a sample ballot from Maine's 2018 Democratic primary, and there were 6 Democratic candidates for governor, and there were 4 candidates for congressional district number 2. And what Maine's ballot prompts each voter to do is relatively straightforward. Every voter indicates her first, second, third, fourth, and so on down the line choice. And depending on the system, one might be required to rank all of their choices. One might be required to rank only their top 3. Long story short, the more choices that voters make, the better the system works. But regardless, hopefully what you see here is that voters are asked to rank order their preferences, and then this is the only ballot that winds up getting submitted, at least in the primary election. The counting, the tabulation, can take a little while. Even in even in a primary election in a relatively small state like Maine, it can take a week or two to get final results in, because the tabulation does take time. The way things generally work is as follows. The first thing that happens is all of the first place votes are tallied up. If any candidate has an absolute majority of first place votes, that person just wins the election outright, right? In that case, it works just like a straightforward majority rule election. If one candidate gets 50% plus one of the first place votes, that individual is automatically the winner. If and when that doesn't happen, the sort of instant runoff elements come into play. If no candidate has an outright majority of first place votes, the candidate with the least number of votes is eliminated. And that person's all of the people who had the losing candidate as their first choice, their votes are then reallocated to their second choice, and then the votes are tabulated again. And so, just to keep things simple, if this bottom candidate here, Sweet, I believe, if she was the last place finisher, she would be dropped from consideration, and everybody who had her as their top choice, their votes would then go to whoever was their second choice. The votes are tabulated again, and if any candidate then has a majority of first place votes, that candidate automatically wins. If there still isn't an absolute majority, the bottom finisher is eliminated once more. His or her first place votes then get reallocated to the voter's second place choice, and the process is reiterated until somebody has an absolute majority of the vote. And that can seem a little bit cumbersome, but I guess it's worth pointing out that under our current system, when no candidate has a majority of the votes, things are also fairly cumbersome, right? Under our current system, one of two things tends to happen if nobody has an absolute majority of the vote. One thing that can happen, probably the most common thing, is that the highest vote getter winds up winning the election. Well, if democracy is majority rule, as many kind of assert it to be, then awarding an electoral result to somebody that a majority voted against seems sort of fundamentally undemocratic, right? If there is if there is no majority, then giving the winner giving the election to somebody who did not command a majority of the vote strikes many as fundamentally unfair. The other alternative in our system generally is to conduct a runoff election. That might be weeks later, that might be months later. That creates a great deal of uncertainty. That creates no small amount of expense, right? Ballots have to be reprinted, polling places have to be opened and staffed, machines have to be serviced and programmed and what have you. And so ranked choice voting, adds a little bit of cumbersomeness on the front end when the ballots are tallied, but it does kind of stave off either electoral results that are to some extent undemocratic, the majority does not rule, or staves off the problem and difficulties that attend to a runoff election, right? Runoff elections often have lower voter turnout because they happen at some point in the future. There is some amount of uncertainty as people and policymakers and the rest of the world, in some cases, wait to see what the outcome could be. Advocates argue that ranked choice voting is an efficient way to really not necessarily guarantee the majority's choice, but if the majority's choice does exist, ranked choice voting is pretty much guaranteed to find it. And with that being said, I think I will turn my spot back over to Dr. Tatum. Thank you, Dillon.
Thanks, Dr. Almeida. I want to direct my next question to Dr. Perez here. Dr. Almeida talked a little bit about ranked choice voting using the example of Maine elections, which use RCV. But ranked choice voting is not a new experiment when it comes to elections. Can you tell us a little bit about how ranked choice voting is deployed in other countries, and particularly in your area of expertise, which is Europe?
Hi, everybody. Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think everybody can see my screen, yes? Okay. Yep, okay, great. Just quickly, I'll try to stick with the main two names for tonight, either ranked choice voting for single member versions or, as Dr. Almeida highlighted, for multi-member versions, it's often called single transferable vote. And what we mean by multi-member is if you imagine that when we elect 2 senators, right? So actually perhaps the recent Georgia runoff, which is one of the few times when there were 2 senators from the same state being elected at the same time, right? And so you're electing 2 people to represent that district simultaneously. It's a little bit different, but that's the basic idea, okay? One that I'll just quickly highlight here, one of my grad school professors used to call this dancing with the stars voting, which I always found amusing, but a nice way to think of it, which if you've ever watched, right, basically, people vote for, they have however many people are left, they have that many less one numbers of votes, so they can vote for everybody except one couple, and whoever each week gets the least number of votes gets dropped, right? So you're taking out the bottom people, and then the following week people can keep voting, right? And so that's the kind of idea of what we're doing here. All right. So to answer Dillon's question, I'm going to focus on 2 examples. So we'll start with Ireland. So Ireland uses ranked choice voting, or the single member version, for its presidency. Now, Ireland's presidency is not as powerful as our presidency. They have a different type of system, but they still have a president, and they elect that person through ranked choice voting. And then they use the multi-member version of this single transferable vote for their parliament, for the European Parliament, for most of their other elections, okay? And so on the side of the screen here, you can see what a ballot for the most recent presidential election looks like. It lists all the people, they put photos on the ballot, and then it asks you to write 1 in the box besides the candidate of your first choice, 2 in the box beside the candidate of your second choice, and so on, okay? So to look at a quick example of how this worked, we're going to go back a little further in time to 2011, because that was the last time that there was no incumbent on the ballot. And so this ballot is unfortunately not as good quality, but it's the same idea as the one we just looked at. And so you can see, right, that there were 7 people running for president. And this image on the left shows the breakdown of the vote by round, okay? So at the bottom, at the first round of the vote, right? We have this bottom piece down here that says others earned like 99,000 votes, okay? And so that was 2 candidates, I think Scallon and Davis maybe, that got the fewest votes, right? So they get dropped out, right? And you can see where their votes get redistributed to. So some people didn't bother to rank anybody further, and they're the leftover, that purple category. But most of the others, right, get redistributed. And then the same thing happens in each round. As kind of the bottom candidate gets dropped out, their votes get redistributed up, okay? And so we can see that Michael D. Higgins, who's been the president of Ireland since 2011, he would have only won 39.6% of the vote, right? Not even close to a majority in the first round of voting. But by the time we finish this whole process, he ends up with well over, or clearly over 50% of the vote, right? 56.8% of the vote, okay? And yes, I think that's what I wanted to highlight there. Okay. So then let's turn our attention to Australia, which uses the single member version of ranked choice voting for the House of Representatives, for their lower house of their legislature. And then they use multi-member districts or single transferable vote for the Senate, okay? And again, I have a sample ballot here so you can see what that looks like, pretty similar. Number the boxes from 1 to 8 in the order of your choice. And one interesting thing about Australia is that they actually require you to rank all 8. So most places that use this these types of voting systems don't necessarily require that, right? And that's how you end up with that leftover, that purple bit in the Irish presidential election, where those people's votes eventually kind of get dropped. But in Australia, they require you to vote for, to rank all of the candidates, okay? And Australia first introduced, so like much of the rest of the, original British Empire, the Australians used to use the same type of first past the post or single member district system that we use. But back in 1918, there was a rise of a third party, the Country Party. It's now become the National Party, which was basically an agrarian party. And so it tended to pull from the conservative wing of the political spectrum, right? It was a lot of small farmers, and they tended to be more conservative. And so the Conservative Party was alarmed by this, didn't want to have the Agrarian Party or the Country Party taking away their votes and having, basically the conservative half of the spectrum sacrifice seats because they were splitting the vote, right? And so then they introduced ranked choice voting in order to avoid that, so that this way, somebody could rank the Country Party first, right, and then like the Conservative second, or vice versa, but that those two parties could still maintain usually the districts that they tended to have, okay? And over time, right, we've gone from, 2 or 3 parties now to, there's still kind of 2 main parties, but to many more third party or smaller parties existing in Australia. And one of the interesting things that Australia does is that, and this gets us a little bit more thinking about what this might look like in practice, is that Australia actually puts out how to vote cards, or actually the parties put these out, okay? So especially because in Australia, you have to rank everybody. That's a lot of work for the voter, right? You're not just choosing who you like most or least, right? Like in our system, but you have to learn about potentially 8, 10, 12 more candidates, right? And so the political parties will put out these pamphlets, and these are actually all posted at the polling places as well, where that give you how the party thinks or recommends that you might vote. So if you were a Green Party, which is the example that I have here, if you were a Green Party voter, right, you might know that you'd want to vote for the Greens first. And maybe that you prefer Labour to the Liberals, right? The Liberal Party in Australia is kind of the classical meaning of liberal, so more economically liberal, but not socially liberal, okay? So they're the more conservative party, even though that might be counterintuitive to what we Americans think of it. And so anyway, so you might know kind of those 2 main parties who you'd want to vote for and where you'd want to rank the Greens. But what do you do with all of these other parties and candidates, right? And so the party gives you a suggestion of how you might want to rank everybody else. And if you can see here, right, some of the others that the Greens suggest you rank highly makes some sense, right? So the Animal Justice Party seems like it would go with the mission of the Greens, right? And then the Australian Labor Party is the larger left-leaning parties. So that would be the kind of probably where most people's votes would end up going, okay? And in this specific election, it did come down to the Labor Party candidate versus the Liberal candidate, right? And so most people who voted for Vanessa Rowland first, right, their votes probably ended up counting for the Labor candidate. So, but one interesting thing about this also is that it allows potentially for deals between the parties. So if the Animal Justice Party, right, or perhaps as a better example, the Labor Party, wants to get the support of all of the voters for these smaller parties, they can say, okay, well, Green Party, we'll put this policy commitment toward, renewable energy or reducing carbon emissions or something like that, right, into our party platform if you will encourage your voters to rank us highly. Okay. And so in this way, the smaller parties that even if they're not tending to win, right, are able to get these policy commitments from the larger parties and potentially have an effect on policy. Just one of the interesting things that ranked choice voting can do for us. All right. And this was just kind of a fun example to wrap up our international examples. So New Zealand recently had a referendum on designing a new flag, and they used ranked choice voting to vote between the different flag designs, right? So this one in the top right there is the flag that they ended up choosing. That's the silver fern with black, white, and blue. But you can see that in round one, if this had just been a plurality election, that would have lost out to a very similar design, to be fair, silver fern, red, white, and blue. But once the losing flag voters, right, redistributed their votes in the following rounds, then the black, white, and blue flag won out over the red, white, and blue one. Okay. And there are other international uses. I'm not going to go into too many of them. As I've kind of alluded to, there's this distinction between the single member and the multi-member. And we do see that actually the multi-member versions are more common, particularly in Europe, which I tend to focus on, where you see them in Ireland, Malta, and then also Scotland, Northern Ireland, and some other subnational elections. But we do see the single member version that I think would be more likely to be applied in the United States, in some places like India, Papua New Guinea, and like New Zealand mayoral elections and stuff like that. And in a lot of places, ranked choice voting is also used for party leadership contests, right? So this doesn't have to just be the final election, right? But for choosing who's going to lead the Labour Party in the UK, right? Or who's going to lead the Conservative Party in Canada. Instead of, a plurality primary, right? You can do it with a ranked choice voting, which we can come back to later, I think. All right, I will end there and hand things back over to Dr. Tatum.
Thanks, Dr. Perez. Even though we're trying to save questions till the end, Brian has a really apropos question here for you, Dr. Perez, that I just want to address real quick, which is voter participation higher in places that have RCV? What do we know about that data?
So generally, yes, but as social scientists, we want to make sure that the variable we're looking at is the one that's causing that. And we probably don't really have enough data to say for sure that it's RCV itself that causes it, right? So one of the reasons, and this is Brian's follow-up question, Australia is one of the main countries that uses ranked choice voting, and they have compulsory voting. So you legally have to go cast your vote there. And so obviously turnout is going to be higher in those elections. And similarly, Malta uses single transferable vote, right? They have fairly high turnout, but you also have there a much smaller electorate, right? And so it's a different environment. So there may be other variables at play, but proponents of ranked choice voting think that turnout will be higher. And we can talk about that a little bit more later on, why that might be. But we don't have solid evidence on that. So yes, it tends to be higher, but we can't say with certainty that this is why.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Almeida, you already mentioned Maine as an example here. Some areas of the US already use ranked choice voting in their elections. Can you speak a little bit about how these election changes came about? So for example, why Maine decided to implement ranked choice voting and how they're working?
I'd be happy to, but actually first, Lauren's comments kind of lead to Brian's question of whether ranked choice voting facilitates or hinders participation. Lauren's comment was spot on. There's not always a lot of data to say. Australia has mandatory voting, and other countries. Several cities in California, San Francisco, Oakland, Davis, and a couple of others whose names, but major cities, right? Several of them have switched to ranked choice voting in municipal elections in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So we actually have a little bit of a natural experiment where there's a pre-change sort of status quo. There's a change from plurality elections to ranked choice voting. And then there have been 4 or 5 election cycles that they've done with ranked choice voting. So if we were going to see changes, that seems like a good place to look for them. And at least the evidence from California is it really hasn't had a significant effect. There's a fair amount of fluctuation in election turnout. Is there a presidential election? What else is going on? And so from election year to election year, there's a fair amount of fluctuation. The cities in California that have adopted ranked choice voting are generally highly educated, pretty affluent cities. And so they tend to have higher voter turnout than other communities as well. But it looks like the change from plurality elections to ranked choice voting in those cities hasn't really had an effect on turnout, either positive or negative. These are municipal elections, and so they might not have quite the draw of federal elections, but there's a kind of a natural place to go looking for it. And there isn't much evidence either way. So there is that. But I think the original question was about ranked choice voting in the U.S. and a couple of folks have particularly asked about Maine. But I want to go back a little bit, because Maine has had a couple of elections with ranked choice voting, but ranked choice voting actually has a little bit more of an interesting history in the United States than I certainly knew before I started to take a look at this. I learned, for example, that the Best Picture Academy Award winner is selected by ranked choice voting. So in one of the most momentous annual decisions, RCV is already implemented. But quite a few cities use RCV. The state of Maine, Alaska just voted in November to implement ranked choice voting starting in the 2022 election. Cambridge, Massachusetts, San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Tacoma Park, Maryland, all use ranked choice voting in local elections, and New York City is going to be doing so as well. North Carolina used it from 2006 to 2013 to fill a particular subset of judicial vacancies, and actually resulted in the first use of ranked choice voting in a statewide general election in 2010. And in that election, in a way sort of similar to the New Zealand flag, the candidate with a plurality in the first round wound up losing by a small margin after the second round when the lower finishers were reallocated. It's also, Dr. Perez mentioned that ranked choice voting is used overseas very often in sort of intra-party elections. And I learned that that's true in the United States as well. I guess, I don't know the history particularly well, but given the time frame, it seems like maybe as a part of some of the progressive reforms from 1912 to 1930, Florida, Maryland, Minnesota, and Wisconsin used ranked choice voting in their party primaries as well. So, while it is while it's not, super common in the United States, it's not coming out of nowhere either. There are, there are kind of isolated places where ranked choice voting, have been used, and it seems like certainly in some areas it's gaining traction. But Maine is the first state to adopt ranked choice voting on the statewide level. And they did that, I believe, in 2015. And that happened by voter initiative, which kind of speaks to questions about, why states have adopted this. And we talk about that in a little bit. But Maine, by initiative, voters adopted ranked choice voting for all primary and general elections for governor, U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and state legislature. That ran into an interesting problem. Maine's constitution requires, and apparently had for some time, requires that the governor and the state legislature be elected by plurality votes. And so the Maine Supreme Court immediately observed that as it was adopted, the ballot initiative was unconstitutional as it applied to the governor and the state legislature. And so after some fits and starts, those parts of the referendum haven't been implemented, but it has been used in primaries and in federal elections since it was adopted. And it generated in 2018 a pretty interesting result. In 2018, in Maine's 2nd congressional district, incumbent Republican Bruce Poliquin lost by a narrow margin in the 2nd round to Jared Golden, a Democrat who currently holds the seat. Poliquin had a narrow lead after the 1st round, but then after the 1st round, 2 independent candidates were eliminated. And when their votes were reallocated, that gave Jared Golden a narrow majority in the 2nd round, and he wound up winning the seat, which he's since maintained. As far as what's been driving the movement towards ranked choice voting, its advocates make a pretty common basket of arguments. They argue that it will stimulate turnout, which, as we've seen, at least from California, does not particularly seem to be the case. They argue, moreover, that it will improve representation, and they argue that it will kind of promote voter engagement. Dr. Perez, I thought the vote suggestions in Australia were very, very interesting to me, because I came across an interesting and similar phenomenon in California. In California, municipal elections are all nonpartisan by law, and so there are no party queues on the ballot. And so in the ranked choice environment, candidates have really kind of changed how they campaign a little bit. They've done exactly or close to exactly what happens in Australia. Candidate Tatum will say, if I am your first choice, Perez should be your 2nd choice. They don't have party queues, but you can but knowledgeable observers, elites, can kind of suggest rankings that kind of approximate, ideological closeness, right? If you like me best, don't vote for Thomas Fitzke, right? And so, they do kind of find ways to approximate information that they are forbidden by law from having on the ballot. Right. Advocates argue that it will improve representation, and one thing that it absolutely does is it really minimizes the incentive provided by our current system to vote strategically. And what I mean by that is, we call a vote strategic if it's not for somebody's first choice. And so in our system, it is commonplace for people to say, well, I really voted against so-and-so, or I preferred this candidate, but she doesn't have a chance to win, so I voted for my 2nd best choice. Our system, encourages people to vote strategically and sort of approximate ranked choice voting anyway, just in an environment that doesn't officially support it. One of, I would argue, the undisputable benefits of ranked choice voting is that it all but eliminates the drive to vote strategically. In a ranked choice system, if your most preferred candidate is from a party that has no chance of winning, you still have a perfectly good reason to rank that candidate first, which is your sincere choice, knowing that when that candidate is eliminated, your votes will still accrue to candidates that eventually have a substantial chance of winning, right? And, I would argue that's a very real advantage. I see we've got questions queued up, and I've kind of, had my say there. So maybe we can turn things back to the audience.
All right, thank you very much. Speaking of advantages, Dr. Almeida talked a little bit about some of the advantages of ranked choice voting. I wanted to ask Dr. Perez if you had any input you wanted to make here about what some of the advantages of an RCV system is. Oh, you're muted, Lauren.
Sorry about that. Helps if I unmute. Okay, so yeah, I'll just pick up on a couple of things that Dr. Almeida just mentioned. So kind of the flip, right, of strategic voting, right, is the idea of sincere and symbolic votes, right? That people should be able to vote for who, basically follow their heart, right? Vote for who they really believe in. And so while it reduces the need for strategic voting, right, it frees people up to vote sincerely or symbolically, right? Because they don't have to worry about, well, if I really like the Green Party candidate in the US and I know they're not going to get elected, right, then I'd be wasting my vote, right? So that would be the strategic thing to do, would be to vote for another candidate. But here I can follow kind of my heart, right? I can do what I want, and I can vote for the Green Party candidate first, right? And then follow that up. And then if you follow that logic through, right, it should help third or minority parties to gain some traction in the system, right? Because while the Green Party still might not, win a presidential election if we suddenly switch to ranked choice voting for presidential elections, nor might the Libertarian Party, right? It would allow them to start to demonstrate the size of their base, right? And if nothing else, right, then the Democrats and the Republicans would be trying to show those voters, that they should pick them second, right, or rank them second, and be trying to appeal to those voters as well. Another one that I believe Dr. Almeida also mentioned kind of back in the answer to his first question, right, is this idea of just that the winner will have actually won more than 50%. Right, that you'll actually have a majority winner, and that also gives that official, that now elected official, a stronger mandate, right? They can say, I actually had a majority of people vote for me, whereas some of the presidents who've won with a minority of the vote, right, start out on this kind of shaky footing of, I know that not half the country voted for me, right? And so what does that mean for my policy agenda? And it also helps reduce the effect of spoilers, right? So a classic example of this, if we think back to the 2000 election with Bush and Gore in Florida, right? And Ralph Nader took a large number of votes, right? Much more than the difference between Bush and Gore. And we could debate whether or not it would have changed anything. But there is at least an argument to be made that if Nader hadn't been in the race, right, that more of his votes would have gone to Gore. Gore might have won Florida and won the presidency, right? And so instead you had, so anyway, so that could have actually changed the outcome of the election. And similarly, if we look at, Maine, right, being the one state that has implemented this statewide, if you look at the gubernatorial races from 1994 to 2014, 9 of 11 times the candidate who won did not have a majority of the vote, right? And there was one election, I'm blanking on the year now, but where there were like 3 candidates all with like 30% of the vote, right? And so you can avoid things like that. Another quick example, I'm actually going to throw this slide up quickly for a second because the picture is so in the recent elections for state senator in Florida, there was the Democratic candidate was named Rodriguez. The Republican candidate was named Ileana Garcia. And they got almost tied, about like 40 votes difference, right? And a third candidate with the same last name as the Democratic candidate had entered the election, right? Now, we could, again, debate if he was a legitimate candidate, but since he never put together any campaign platform or materials or website, right, it seems like he may have entered just to try to steal some votes from the Democratic candidate Rodriguez by having the last name. And he did win 6,000 votes, right? And so there's a potential there that he spoiled that race between the two of them. Another quick example, advantage, at the beginning, Dr. Almeida talked a little bit about some of the alternatives, right? And that one of them is the system of full runoff elections, right? So like what we just saw in Georgia, that the whole country was paying some attention to since the Senate hinged on it. And instead of, making everybody come back out and vote twice, right? It's much easier if you can do it all in one trip to the polls. So it's easier for voters, especially for military and overseas voters. And I see that Nicole commented in the chat that even in South Carolina, if we had a runoff for an election, military and overseas voters do vote by ranked choice voting so that they can still participate in the runoff, because there usually isn't time for those voters to be able to get sent new ballots and send them back, right? And so the only way for that group of voters to be able to participate in a runoff election is to use ranked choice voting. It's also only one election for governments to administer, right? So instead of the state of Georgia or any other state, right, having to put on 2 elections, especially in the middle of a pandemic, right, and have everybody, pay for poll workers twice and all of that, right? It's only, you can only do it once. And since it is easier for everybody, that usually means that there's less drop off between rounds, right? Less people who don't bother to come back and vote in the second round, or in the case of ranked choice voting, don't bother to rank somebody second. And that's especially true for the least advantaged voters, right? So if, you are, if you work a job where you are on shifts and you can't get time off to go vote on election day, or you have to, if it's difficult for you to get to the polls, right, or anything else that puts challenges up for voters, right, doing it twice is that much harder, and we see a lot of drop off in that group of voters in a 2-round runoff election, right? And so then with ranked choice voting, right, this is particularly important for getting those people to be able to turn out again in the second round. It's also faster, right? A lot of us might have preferred to know what was going to happen with those Senate seats from Georgia a week or 2 after the election, right, rather than having to wait until January, right? So that's another advantage over a 2-round system. And then we haven't talked much about the kind of wider set of electoral system alternatives, but some countries use proportional representation, where you mostly vote for a party, right? And so one final advantage of ranked choice voting, I think, from the US perspective, is that it's still constituency focused, right? You're still voting for a person who's then going to be focused on their constituency, right? So it's a candidate centered, and then the candidate is focused on their constituency, as opposed to more of a party-based and nationalized system. And I'll leave that there for now. Thanks.
Excellent. And so as I asked Dr. Perez about the advantages of ranked choice voting, I wanted to ask Dr. Almeida about the converse here. What are some of the disadvantages? And you talked a little bit about this in the first part of the discussion here, but as you mentioned, there was this Maine politician named Gordon Vail, and he wrote in an op-ed, in Central Maine News when they were debating RCV. He said, quote, advocates want to replace real democracy. He's arguing that this is not real democracy, in which a majority picks the winner, with something akin to a game show method of selection. The result could be more like Family Feud than a decision about one of the most important choices an individual can make. Is that kind of argument fair here? In what ways are there real disadvantages of RCV?
Well, as from the perspective of it being a, pardon me, from the perspective of elections being a mechanism to determine the people's choice, ranked choice voting does not have a lot of disadvantages in that regard, right? In that regard, it is superior to plurality voting, first past the post voting, our system, in pretty much every way. I think resistance comes mostly from the fact that it's new and on first blush, isn't as intuitively appealing, right? The idea of ranking candidates and first, second, and third place. I think a lot of that is simply not the way we have done it, and therefore it generates resistance. I saw that quote by Mr. Vale, or I don't remember his last name, I beg your pardon. And at first I was kind of irritated because it's sort of hyperbolic and it kind of deliberately trivializes. But then, he used specifically the example of Family Feud, and that got me thinking about Family Feud. And what's the whole point of Family Feud? You try, 100 people are asked some random question, and you, the contestant's job is to try to find out what the most common, the most popular answers were. That's what a voting system should do, right? So, he uses this example to kind of trivialize it. And as I thought about it, I was like, well, is that so bad, right? I would say, that ranked choice voting does a better job of ascertaining what people really want than our system does. And the mechanism of that is straightforward. As I said in my initial comments, it puts more information into the system. Our system requires you to choose either the candidate that you want or vote against the candidate that you want least. Ranked choice voting just puts in so much more information than that, in a way that I really think is very natural in people's real life. Perhaps I'm thinking about food too much, but it's, sort of a universal. How many people in the audience have told somebody, get me a chocolate cone, and if they don't have that, get me vanilla soft serve, right? Because what do you want to avoid? You want to avoid texting back and forth. I'm at the window. They don't have chocolate chip. Do they have strawberry? No, right? That's inefficient. That's irritating. That's not helpful, right? What all of us have done in some way, shape, or form is said, I want this, and if they don't have it, I'll take that, and if they don't have that, I'll have some other choice. And it makes things easier, and then everybody gets more of what they want. And in a very real way, that's exactly what ranked choice voting does. There's some math behind this, but for any electoral system, one of three things has got to be true for it. Either there is a dictator, one person who can decide the outcome herself, or it is subject to strategic voting, or I should have committed the third to memory, or there are only two possible outcomes, right? Our system, first past the post system, limits the choices to two outcomes. And ranked choice voting really does kind of get rid of, does get rid of that possibility. I think, I had a conversation similar to this with an acquaintance some years ago, and that acquaintance's comment was, well, I don't like that it doesn't really produce like a winner. And I was like, well, yes, it does. And then we talked about it, and he said, well, I suppose if your goal is to produce the best candidate, it's a good idea. And I was like, well, what else is, like, I mean, it's not an MMA match, it's a, it's an election. And so, I mean, I think its disadvantages are the newness and the sort of unintuitiveness of it. But also, to speak to another question from the comments, it does take longer to tabulate the results on the front end. The trade-off is, we don't have a true nationwide election, but like in a big state like California or Texas, a statewide ranked choice election might take 3 weeks or a month to tabulate fully. But then you get rid of the possibility of a runoff weeks or months down the road. So, in politics, there are pretty much always trade-offs. Those would be the major trade-offs for ranked choice voting.
Great. Thank you very much. One last question before we turn to the audience here. Dr. Perez, in the US, we obviously have two major political parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. What effects might we expect RCV to have if it were adopted more broadly in the US on the two-party system?
Thanks. So I will jump in with some recent polling that came out from NBC News. So they were trying to get at the question of whether there are really two parties in kind of how people identify in the US populace, right? Or whether we should think of there as being four, right? And so they show that if you only give people the two choices that we currently give them in elections, right? That you have about 42% of people identifying more with the Democrats, 37% identifying with the Republicans, and then about 12% of people identifying as independents. But if you break up the two main parties into kind of their wings, then you end up with, here they get four perfectly sized parties, right? That probably if we took a different poll, we would get something a little bit different. But right, a Trump Republican Party, a kind of more, traditional Republican Party, a Biden Democrat Party, and then a Sanders Warren Democrat Party. Okay. And so one possibility, right, is that if we switch to a system like this, right, then you could have more of these parties, right? And it would be okay, in theory, to run a Trump Republican and a party Republican in the same election without them decimating each other in the election, because, right, they could encourage their voters to rank them 1 and 2. And I think I'm just going to try to pick up on a couple of the questions from the chat that I saw as I go through this, since it's getting a little bit later. One of the questions was whether or not this is something that Democrats or Republicans tend to be more in favor of. And I don't think that there's any reason why it should be partisan. I think you have maybe in the last couple of years heard a little bit more from the Democrats about this. Andrew Yang has been a big proponent of it. And I guess in Maine, the Republican most of the opposition has tended to come from the Republican wing. But, a few weeks ago, Donald Trump was talking about starting this Patriot Party. If they do that, Republicans would be 100% on board with ranked choice voting, because otherwise, right, if you split in all these places, if you split the Republican vote, or the current Republican vote, between a Trump Republican Party or a Patriot Party, right, and the existing Republican Party, then the Democrats would win many of those elections, right, because you'd be splitting up that vote. And so if something like that were to occur, right, then you could see the Republicans suddenly becoming very big fans of ranked choice voting. So I think it kind of depends on the context, and I don't think that there's any real reason why it would favor one or the other, right? And here I use this example of these 4 parties that NBC News put out, mostly because there was some recent data on it, but you could imagine, right, that there might be quite a number of other potential parties, at least down the road, right? I do think that our system is pretty polarized, and we have a pretty long tradition of 2 parties in this country. I don't think you'd see overnight a ton of new parties popping up. But over time, right, Green Party, Libertarian Party, some sort of center party, right, might be able to start to get more votes, right? And then in a place like, New York, right, maybe you could have a Biden Democrat running against a Sanders Warren Democrat, right? And in Wyoming, you could have a Trump Republican running against a party Republican, right? And so you might get some more competition that way. It would also matter, I think, in terms of independence, right? I'll take this slide down now. But Mike Bloomberg decided to run in the Democratic primary, I can speak Democratic primary, instead of running in the general election, because he was concerned that he would split, in particular, the Democratic vote, right? And allow Trump to win the election if he ran as a full independent in the general election. And that's what Harold Schultz talked about doing for a while, right? And everybody got very upset about it. But in a ranked choice voting situation where he wouldn't necessarily steal votes from the Democrat or either candidate, right? Then I think you might see more independents running in US elections as well. And I'll leave that there. I have a couple other things I can pick up on when we do questions from the audience. So thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And so let's go ahead and pick up some questions from the audience. We've actually done a pretty okay job in terms of integrating questions in with the discussion, but go ahead and type in some questions if you have any for us. One of the ones from a little bit earlier that I thought brought something to my mind, which is this question of gerrymandering, or the issue of elections where you're in districts that are very heavily tilted toward one party or the other. Is there a use for ranked choice voting outside of primary elections, say in highly ideologically cohesive districts? So like if you have a district, for example, where the Republican candidate usually wins by 70 percentage points, right? Is there a usage outside of primaries for ranked choice voting in districts like that?
Maybe not, but those districts are relatively rare, right? It's really hard to draw districts that are so heavily favor one party consistently, right? And so parties really have to choose carefully how they're going to, how they're going to district. I think the sort of modal district probably has a slant of more like 3 to 5%, right? Where the district is marginally competitive, but provides a noticeable edge to one party's candidate. And I think in that regard, ranked choice voting could be helpful, but in a way, those or maybe in a way that speaks to that speaks to some broader issues. Changing the voting system can only have a certain amount of effect if the drawing of the districts themselves are uncompetitive, right? If the districts are themselves drawn to be uncompetitive. If districts are that uncompetitive, then it's hard to imagine any structural reform that could remedy, that kind of significant effect. But I would ask Lauren in particular, how are districts drawn, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK? Are they drawn, not in a nonpartisan way, or do they suffer some of the same problems that we do?
So I'm not an expert on everywhere, but most places have less gerrymandering than we do, I think. And then a lot of places do it by more either kind of geographical or historical lines, right, where they don't redraw them as often, and you have either kind of by like county or by, especially when you get into some of these systems that do have the multi-member districts, right, then it's much easier. You don't need to break things up as much. So you can do by county or even by like state And so then it's, just like we can't really gerrymander the Senate, right? Then you can't really gerrymander those districts. And so, yeah, so in general, I would just say, I mean, it's not that it doesn't happen anywhere else, but it's not, it doesn't tend to be as big of an issue in other places.
Thomas Fitzke asks a really interesting question about negative advertising in RCV. So what are these, in countries that have RCV or in municipalities or areas in the United States that have RCV, do we notice less negative advertising, or are the way that candidates advertise for elections largely similar here?
So this was a study that was done in some of those cities in California. And to be fair, I did choose the graph that was more noticeable. So there's another study that they did in like 2014 or 2015 where the differences aren't quite as stark, but they found the same effect, right? And so they surveyed people in cities that were using ranked choice voting, and then cities that were similar in a number of ways, but that were not using ranked choice voting. And this question, they asked people how much time candidates spent criticizing their opponents. And you can see for the a great deal of time, right, it was much higher in the cities that weren't using ranked choice voting, right? And then the percentage of people saying they weren't doing this at all was much higher in the ranked choice voting cities. And like I said, in 2014 or 2015, right, they did a similar survey. And the results weren't quite as stark, but they still went in that general direction. And they asked a number of other questions as well, right, along a similar line, and did tend to find that, yes, people spent less time, but basically people were more civil, right? Because you're trying to get your opponent's voters to still choose you as your second choice. And so that people do tend to, be more collaborative and spend less time on negative advertising. Because some of what we've learned about negative advertising, right, is that it hurts you. Like if you do the negative advertising, it hurts you, but it hurts your opponent more, right? And so in a head-to-head contest, that's kind of winner take all, right? That can still work in your favor, even if you hurt yourself. If you hurt your opponent more, right, then you still come out on top. But in a system like ranked choice voting, right, where you want as many people to think highly of you and to rate you highly, right, or to rank you highly, then you want to not kind of hurt yourself by going negative on other people.
Great. And another question we have here that either Dr. Almeida or Dr. Perez can take is David Whiteman asks if there are people or groups working for RCV in South Carolina. Nicole Sanchez brings up that Better Ballot SC is doing work on advocating for RCV in South Carolina. But the second part of his question is actually very interesting as well, which is, do you think that it's something possible in our region, in our area, to have some point in the future where RCV becomes a part of electoral politics in South Carolina?
That's tough to say. I mean, I wonder if in South Carolina that has, pardon me, a really clear partisan slant. I mean, I think one of the effects of that is that, since most of the public here is Republican, then most voters are probably pretty satisfied with electoral outcomes, right? Our statewide elections tend to be decided in pretty lopsided fashion. And as Lauren pointed out, one of the things that seems to have motivated the press towards ranked choice voting in Maine was that there was a really long period where the governorship was decided, with relatively small pluralities, right? And and people were, I think, relatively frustrated with that. And I'm not sure that that's the case in a state like ours. Might it be true in the future? Of course it could, but I'm not sure that I see much impetus for it, right now.
I would not disagree. I think unless, Trump does start the Patriot Party, and then I think we'd see it or interest in it quite rapidly. But one of the places that I see kind of maybe the first application for this is in party primaries. I think that, we have quite a polarized electorate in the US, and I do think that ranked choice voting could help reduce polarization. But immediately, I don't think it would have like a huge effect, because I think a lot of people would still vote for the candidate of the party that they would vote for. But if you look at some of the, particularly presidential primaries are the easiest to think about, but any primary, right? Then it seems like people have, first of all, their preferences aren't as strong, right? They don't, whereas you might, love the Republican and hate the Democrat, or vice versa, right? Within a primary, you might like a whole bunch of the candidates, right? And, part of what, if we look at the 2020 Democratic primary, right, then, Bernie Sanders was one of the kind of final two candidates standing. But you could make the argument that there were a lot more moderate voters in the Democratic Party, and that was where, and that's perhaps why also Biden did end up getting the nomination. But it required this quick dropout, right before Super Tuesday, of Buttigieg and Klobuchar and a bunch of these other candidates that were kind of in that moderate lane, in order to kind of then throw their weight behind Biden and help him kind of rally to get enough votes on Super Tuesday to take the lead. And if you had people ranking their candidates from the beginning, then I think that you could see, anyway, I think you could avoid some of that. You might end up people being a little bit happier with the nominees. And I think that since there's no inter-party loss at risk, that people might be more interested and willing in accepting that, right? So in South Carolina, right, maybe, for a Republican primary, it could be very interesting for people to be able to, rank the candidates and have a bit more of a say there. And perhaps even in some ways, more importantly, for the Democratic primary, if South Carolina stays early in the system. But so I think that would be an interesting application where we might see it first in South Carolina before general elections.
Excellent. Are there any other questions that our audience has here for Dr. Almeida or Dr. Perez?
Somebody was asking about, yes, so is it cheaper? It depends a little bit. I think I've seen that a couple of times in here. It depends a little bit on what you're comparing to, but certainly if you were actually going to have 2 rounds of runoffs, so something like what Georgia did, right, where you have to have everybody come out, or 2 rounds of elections, one of which is a runoff, where you have to have everybody come out twice, then yes, ranked choice voting is definitely cheaper. And then as far as, and then also if some places will get rid of the primaries, at least for certain types of elections. So if you get rid of a primary, that would also cut down on the number of elections that you have to hold and reduce costs that way. If you're still going to hold the same number of elections, then it probably doesn't change costs that much. The biggest immediate thing would probably be just making sure that the voting machines can handle it. But I think something that I saw said that pretty much all of the state-of-the-art voting machines at this point can handle ranked choice voting. And since South Carolina just got new machines, hopefully they could handle it. So I don't know that it would change costs a ton for South Carolina, to be honest.
And Charlotte raises this really interesting question as well about not just money on holding the elections, but do we see RCV having an effect on how much money campaigns spend on elections?
I haven't seen much data on that. I don't.
Nor I.
I guess you could imagine, right, that if things are less kind of winner take all, that maybe there would be a little less reason to kind of dump as much negative money onto your opponents and stuff like that. But I don't think I haven't seen any data to know for sure about that.
It's probably also worth mentioning that the majority of money spent on elections is complete dark money that can't be tracked at all. So, when we look at, what candidates spend, sort of hard money, that's increasingly dwarfed by, completely untrackable oceans of money, that have no, specific dollar values or provenance. So, campaign spending, is, kind of increasingly sort of murky in general.
All right, very good. Any other questions here? All right, Dr. Almeida and Dr. Perez, was there anything else you wanted to mention or discuss real quick before we close off here?
I think we've certainly done yeoman work and covered not just the basics, but really kind of gotten into the weeds on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we've covered all of the important points, and I think this was a really enjoyable discussion. So thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for a productive conversation this evening. I certainly learned a lot. And I'd especially like to thank Dr. Almeida and Dr. Perez for their expertise on this issue, and the audience for some excellent discussion and some excellent questions here. So this, I believe this webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand after the webinar itself. But again, thank you very much for coming out to listen to us talk about ranked choice voting. And again, thanks to SC Humanities and Francis Marion University for setting this up for us.
And also one last thing, please remember that SC Humanities has a survey on their website that they asked individuals who have who've been to the webinar. If you want to go to their website and fill out the survey on how you think it went, I imagine they and we would be very glad for the feedback. And thank you all very much for coming out on this chilly Monday evening.
And happy President's Day.
Ah, yes.
There we go. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dillon.